Today, it's been 28 days since I didn't get into Soho House, and yet I'm still here. On today's episode, the addiction crisis in Oregon and who is fixing it. We'll be right back. Welcome to Portland Tea Party. I am your host, Ciara Pressler, and this is our show about Portland, the tea, and where the party's at. And thank you for being here today. We love coming to you live. Why do we do this show live? Because if we went to edit it, it would never get posted. So this makes us JFDI, or as we say at my company pregame, just fucking do it. So I encourage you to, if you are thinking of creating something, if you're thinking of getting involved in your community, if you're thinking of talking to someone about what's going on or getting involved at a very local level, just do it. Just effing do it, right? I listened to a great podcast episode this week. We'll have to link it in the show notes. It's the podcast Offline. If you're not subscribed to it, it's really great. It's just about like the effects of the internet. It started out with them trying to like be off their phones and seeing how that went. Really intelligent conversation. But the episode this week is, are you a political hobbyist? And I was like, okay, I better listen to this. You know I'm trying to be very strict on my politics diet this year. I am not checking the news every 2 seconds. I am not listening to NPR for 3 hours every morning anymore. I figure the big news stories are gonna get to me by the end of the day anyways, and I'm super focused on local. So this concept of being a political hobbyist was like, do you read the news and form opinions and like repost stuff on social media and things that don't actually move the needle to making the community better? Whereas the best possible thing you can do is get involved hyper locally. So are any of us really gonna change the outcome of the federal election, the election for president here in Oregon? Probably not. I'm not discouraging you from getting involved. It's important. It's going to be close. We have to get involved. But the place you can really make change is on the local level. Like, what is the most hyper-local nonprofit organization doing the work in the community? Can you volunteer your time? Can you donate? Can you meet your local leaders? We're going to get even more local next year with different city council districts, 12 councilors instead of 4. And so there's all these new opportunities coming up about getting involved, and that includes helping to shape the new government of Portland next year. So I'm doing my best to explain to you what's happening. It's a lot. We're breaking it down into bite-sized pieces, and we're also exploring the actual issues that we all care about and who are the people behind the scenes or out front actually trying to make a difference and create solutions. And if there's one thing I've learned over the past year, it's that all these problems are way more complex than I understood before. You know, when I'm just reading the news or I just see something happening on the street, I'll think, you know, like, why don't they just do this? Why don't they just build more housing? Why don't they just build more recovery centers? Well, it's not that simple because our government is like all kinds of different things wound up together, and all these problems and issues relate to each other. Let's learn more about it. You don't want to hear it from me, you want to hear it from an expert. So I'm very excited today for our first guest for Portland. You will meet him when we are right back. Welcome back for our Portland segment. Today we are welcoming the Executive Director of Oregon Recovers, Mike Marshall. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me. It's exciting to be here.
I've been wanting to talk to you since before this show started, and we're on episode 14 this week.
Okay.
So I'm glad you could join us. Tell us about what is Oregon Recovers.
Yeah, so I'm a person in long-term recovery. I have 16 years.
Wow.
And yeah, it's exciting. Oregon Recovers is a movement of people in recovery, their friends and family, trying to end Oregon's addiction crisis. We came together 7 years ago because Oregon consistently ranks last in access to treatment, as we all know in Portland. And we have the second highest addiction rate in the country. And so our goal was to create a mobilizing force of people in recovery, a constituency, to the point you're making earlier about we really need to impact government. And so we spent the last 7 years really advocating for changes to the system. And it's been slow going, and COVID didn't help, and Measure 110 sort of screwed things up. But some really great things have occurred as well, and I'm starting to feel more guardedly optimistic than I have over the last 5 years.
Okay, I want to get to that, but first let's break down the problem, because I heard a lot of things in there that I don't understand why they're the case. So first of all, why does Oregon rank so low in recovery?
In access to treatment?
Yeah.
The short answer is that our reimbursement rates, our Medicaid reimbursement rates, kind of wonky stuff, are some of the lowest in the country. And so, and with the Affordable Care Act, people don't realize this, is all of a sudden insurance providers had to pay for treatment. However, it changed the financial model. Previously, treatment providers were paid for beds, and if they were empty or they were full, they were paid for beds, so they could cover their staffing and their overhead and all that. After the Affordable Care Act, they were paid for butts in beds. And so they're incentivized to keep a small inventory of empty beds as possible. And so and then on top of it, we haven't had any state leadership until the most recent governor came along. Governor Brown was sort of a disaster relative to this issue. And there was no one saying, hey, this is what a continuum of care looks like. We need to put investments here, 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 and here, and connect all the dots. The problem isn't that the system has been failing. The problem is that the system is fractured and incomplete. And so there are really good people doing really good work in different silos of the system. And unfortunately, their work is often diminished because the minute someone walks out of treatment, they didn't have recovery housing. They were dealing with criminal pasts that they couldn't get expunged, things like that.
So we're already seeing the complexity of this issue where it overlaps or weaves together with housing, but also the criminal justice system. So when you talked about the stages, is there a path that requires maybe different types of institutions in the way that housing would, like shelters, but they're not long-term, so then you need transitional housing, and there could be several steps before there's permanent housing. Yes. So what would the steps be?
So a continuum of care that's integrated, and some people enter it at different places, and then they fall back to another part of it. But first of all, we need way more prevention. Oregon is pretty much last in the country in terms of investing in prevention. So that's a big part of this problem. But then we need sobering centers where cops can take people to someplace instead of a jail cell, to recover from a binge or whatever the case may be. Portland's Sobering Center closed 5 years ago, and we're still struggling to get it reopened.
That's Hooper Detox.
No,
right?
Hooper. Then there's Detox.
Oh,
Sobering
different?
is like the old-fashioned drunk tank, right? Where
wow.
cops, instead of arresting someone and putting them in jail, could drop them off and they could sleep it off back when it was just alcohol. And one of the reasons it closed 5 years ago was because all of a sudden meth became a much bigger deal again, and putting people that were high on meth and people that were drunk in the same room was problematic. Yeah. And so Central City Concern said, this is not what we do for the most part, so we're going to close this. And the city has struggled ever since to try and get it reopened, largely due to a lack of leadership on the city council and in the mayor's office.
So are there the resources there, like the money and everything like that, or is it that there's not political will to get it done?
It has been both, and now there is political will. In fact, the governor just moved $25 million in the latest legislative session to give Portland to reopen a sobering center. But we don't just need one, we need one in every quadrant of the city, right?
Yeah, all the districts. What, just for grounding that amount, 25 million, like what do you think it would cost to actually solve the problem?
Well, to solve the whole problem,
yeah.
or just the absence of a sobering
both.
center? It's hard to put a number on it because we've got a lot of money in the system. In the last 3 years, since the start of COVID, we moved about $1 billion into the treatment system. much of it went to mental health, and mental health and addiction are often treated separately. That sometimes makes sense, it sometimes doesn't, but it's how the silos are built up, and we need to deconstruct it. Meanwhile, we want to get more treatment in place. So recently a study came out that said we need, I think, 3,000 more treatment beds in the state, residential treatment beds, and it's going to cost $500 million. Well, no, we don't need that many treatment beds. What we need are outpatient slots, which are really cheap, and then we need recovery housing, which is really cheap as well. And people can be in a supportive recovery housing that is abstinence only, and that's a big challenge in the system. Is we've had housing first policies where someone comes out of detox, they go to a supportive housing environment, but the person in the apartment next door is practicing harm reduction and they're doing abstinence. And that's really hard to be around people using drugs or drinking alcohol, right, when you're getting sober.
Yeah.
And so we need more recovery housing, which is, there's 30 organizations in this county that can pop up in 90 days a new recovery house.
Wow.
And so, but we're making progress there. The county recently moved $10 million into recovery housing, and then the legislature, with the recriminalization of drugs, moved another 19 million for the state. So we'll see, 4 or 5 million here in the metropolitan area. So we're starting to see that come together. But back to your issue around detox, which is medically supervised withdrawal management. We only have Hooper Detox here, and then we have Fora Health, and now there's one called Recovery Works Northwest. But we need to double or triple the amount of detox we have in order to meet the need, because every day 50% of the people in line at Hooper are turned away.
It's heartbreaking.
And they know that when they go, so there's probably a lot more people who just are like, what's the point? I'm just gonna be turned away, right?
And another thing I learned, Oregon Humanities hosted a great talk with the journalist who covers homelessness and writes for the New York Times. And he made the point that, like, if you are experiencing like acute difficulties in Northwest Portland and you have to get to Gresham without transportation or money, like, you're not going there.
Right. Well, and I will say this, the absence of just being able to walk through the door for a detox center or even a treatment center, when I got sober, I woke up one morning and I had pink eye in both eyes. I was broke, I was estranged from my family. I was just done, right? And I reached out to a friend, and thankfully that friend then took me and helped me. But if, like, that there, I hadn't got an immediate response. If I had been told, I'm sorry, you're gonna have to wait 3 weeks to get into a treatment bed, I would have started using again. Yeah. Probably with the intention of, okay, I'll use for 3 weeks and then I'll do it. But that doesn't happen, right?
Yeah.
And so
we're gonna talk more about how that works. One thing I want to distinguish here, though, as we start to educate people about the nature of addiction, which is still being researched and understood, is the difference between a binge and needing like medical detox. So like, you could be out partying too hard and you have like that embarrassing friend and they're drunk and they get in trouble with the law. That doesn't necessarily mean they're an addict.
Right.
Is my understanding.
Correct.
Versus someone who, if they stop drinking, it is a medical crisis.
Yep.
And I've seen close people in my life go through that. It's an entirely different thing.
It's absolutely, and what people don't realize is alcohol is the driving force behind this addiction crisis. More than half the people in treatment, half the people in detox are there for alcohol, not for meth or fentanyl. And so we lose 6 people a day in alcohol-related deaths compared to 2 to 3 drug overdose deaths.
I did not know that. And I think because alcohol is something that most adults experience, that there's a naivete about the difference between enjoying alcohol and being addicted to alcohol.
Absolutely. And to your point about binge drinking, yes, that doesn't mean you're addicted to alcohol, but it is a precursor for developing an addiction to alcohol. Underage drinking and binge drinking are the 2 leading contributors to someone who develops addiction later in their life.
Whoa, I thought it was trauma and genetics.
Well, there is that as well. But if someone, as a result of that trauma or genetics, it's a biopsychosocial disease. So you can be biologically prone to it, you can have trauma, some psychological effect, or socializing. And that's why the fastest growing demographic of people that develop addiction are over 55. Because they have money, they have time, their whole social life is built around alcohol. You know, you go into these nursing homes or retirement centers, and it's all about happy hour, right?
Really?
Yes,
I didn't know
totally.
That. I'm hoping to move into an over 55 community as soon as possible, but I didn't know that was what was going on there.
Yeah. So, but there's the statistic I think is if you start drinking before you're 16, you're like 40% more likely to develop some level of addiction than if you wait until you're 18 or 19 years old.
Right, it's
and
like smoking in that way.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's learned behavior at a young age. And it makes sense, right? You're going through all these emotions, you're learning how to navigate those emotions by pouring substances on it. Or getting high or whatever, smoking dope, whatever the case may be. And so, and then binge drinking often leads to then addictive drinking.
Yeah.
And so that's why we need to really focus our efforts on those things, and the easiest way to reduce both those things is to raise the price of alcohol. Which the alcohol
interesting. Yeah. Is it like cigarettes now that they're so expensive?
It's exactly like cigarettes.
Yeah.
But the difference is the alcohol industry in Oregon has opposed any efforts to raise taxes on alcohol since Reagan was president.
I mean, haven't they in every state? I would imagine that would be on their agenda everywhere.
I mean, they've like Maryland. It's true. It's been 15 years since a state raised alcohol prices, and that was in Maryland. Alaska, I think the city of Anchorage recently did it, but it was a 10-year fight. The alcohol industry is. We think of our craft breweries and our wineries where we go to weddings, and but as an industry, they are not any different than the tobacco industry.
So.
Yeah.
So, if we're talking about the need for like acute treatment, and then, downstream from that is recovery housing, and hopefully people can transition to like self-sufficient lives at some point. If we have more of this, does it take away some of the pressure of this because you have less people who have cycled through it multiple times? And then also, if we're focusing, of course, on prevention more, does it take some pressure off of that first step?
Oh, totally.
Okay.
If we put more money into prevention and just reduce people's use to begin with, that's the most effective use of tax dollars, right? But secondly, if let's say we double the detox capacity here in Portland, it means that we're going to need to quadruple or exponentially increase the number of residential treatment beds and or the number of recovery housing beds, because you cycle through detox 4 or 5 days, but then you go into these other places either for 28 days or in terms of residential treatment, or you can stay for a year in a recovery house. And so the more you're by detoxing more people every day, you're creating more demand for the system farther down. Yeah. But those parts of the system are much cheaper than detox or residential treatment.
Get people over there, it's less burden to the public. Okay, so a couple more questions. I've been wanting to talk to you for so long, and I think most people misunderstand the nature of addiction. So I appreciate you saying that it's biopsychosocial.
Yes.
One thing I like to do on Saturday nights is read the 70-page NIH report on alcoholism. No, because I want to understand it, and there's a lot of misunderstanding, and they classify it as a mental illness, which I think is actually more helpful than classifying it as a disease, because so many people are like, if it's a disease, why don't you just take a pill and go to treatment? Like cancer, it doesn't work that way. It's like something you have to manage.
It's a chronic condition,
like diabetes or something.
Exactly.
Yeah, but it's also a mental illness, which is why it causes so much havoc in society.
Yeah, correct. And the thing about it is, as a chronic condition, according to the Surgeon General, if we keep someone in recovery for 60 months, 5 years, their chance of relapse, if they then go out into the world and there's no more support offered to them, their chance of relapse goes down to 15%. The same is not true of diabetes or hypertension or any other chronic health condition. So we're not, we should be spending more money on keeping people in recovery, and that's why a much larger investment in recovery housing, expungement clinics, job training, all of that is really a good bang for the buck relative to the taxpayers' investment in those folks. And we don't have the challenges we have, here in Portland.
I love that you're coming with the stats. and a plan. On the website for Oregon Recovers, there's a 12-step, get it?
OregonRecovers.org.
Plan for what you think should happen. So just tell us a little bit about some of the tangible things that you do in advocacy. Like if you're going to the state legislature, what are you asking them for besides money?
Well, before we go to the legislature, what we have done successfully, I believe, is build a constituency. And so we do annual walks for recovery in September during National Recovery Month. We do it in 6 cities around the state.
Oh, wow.
We do an annual conference. We just had it about last month here in Portland, the Recovery Community Summit. And then we do Advocacy Day, where we bring over 300 people from every Senate district in the state to come and meet with their legislators. And they're not necessarily advocating for this bill or that bill per se, because it's a short amount of time, but it's about telling their stories and getting the legislators to tell us their stories. And every one of them has a story. Now, not all of them will share, but that's hugely important because what's happened in the past is when they've had to cut budgets or decide to put money here or put money there, there's been nobody arguing for addiction and addiction recovery, right? And so now we have changed that dynamic, and as a result, you've seen so much focus on addiction. Now, it's not all been good in terms of policy decisions, but so then every legislative session, we usually have, Oregon Recovers is focused on, over the years, trying to create a better system to address this issue. So our very first efforts in 2017, 2018 was to require the dormant Alcohol and Drug Policy Commission to create a strategic plan to address the addiction crisis. There was no plan.
Often, as a strategic planner, there is often no plan to begin with.
And and that happened, and then we worked to support that planning process. We helped get the RFP out. We did 5 roundtable discussions and wrote reports that we submitted to the to the Alcohol and Drug Policy Commission. We lobbied the governor to appoint the first addiction doctor ever to the Alcohol and Drug Policy Commission.
That's great.
Why did it take that long? But anyway, the report was done in February 2020 and handed to the governor, and she put it on a shelf. She announced beforehand that she wasn't going to do anything with it, but then the next month COVID happened, right? And it just demonstrated how the system was so fractured and incomplete when overnight our support system for people in recovery disappeared. And so we pivoted to supporting the recovery community and making sure we launched a website called the Recovery Network of Oregon, and if you get recoverynetworkoforegon.org, and on there you can find AA meetings, recovery housing, treatment providers. It's all geolocated, as my husband calls it, Grindr for recovery.
Can we swipe, like, don't like that one, do like that one?
You can, basically. So we have an app now that we launched in January, so just download it from the App Store.
Wow, that's great.
It's awesome. The state should do it, but they haven't. They can tell you where to buy alcohol, but they can't tell you where to buy recovery. The Recovery Network of Oregon does that, and we launched that during COVID, and it was crowdsourced. It was put together with chewing gum and Band-Aids, but now it's we got a $1 million grant from Care Oregon last year, and so it's really spectacular and can help an awful lot of people.
It's clear that in the short time that Oregon Recovers has been a formal organization that you've done a ton of work, and they're really lucky to have you.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yes, and
it's a team effort. There are a lot of people involved in the work that we do.
Yes, and a really strong board, I noticed, on your website too.
We have a great board, and it's primarily people. Virtually everyone on the board right now is in recovery and works within a recovery organization.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you are running for office.
I am a candidate for Portland City Council in District 2, North
That's
and
my
Northeast
district.
Portland. Excellent.
You better be like Courtney.
Pick me as number 1.
So that's Northeast Portland and North Portland.
Yep.
And why would you make this change from the important and effective work that you're doing to this totally different role?
So a couple of things. Number 1, it's time for Oregon Recovers to have a new leader. Like I was the co-founder and I've been the executive director. We're a movement. It's time for some fresh blood. I think I'm really proud of the work that we've done. But sort of what provoked me into running for city council, it wasn't anything that was on my radar screen a year ago, was the fact that we couldn't get a sobering center open after 5 years and $1.5 million in consultants, and there's nothing, right? And so and that's largely a leadership issue, and there's no one on the city council in recovery. There's no one in the county in recovery, and I just felt like we need to get people in recovery into elected offices so that we can be a driving force on reforming. This is such a crisis, not just for Portland, but the whole state. But if we can fix it here, we can fix it everywhere. Number one. Number two, I'm a geek for democracy. When the Berlin Wall came down a long time ago, I went to work for the National Democratic Institute.
I saw that in your bio.
Yeah, and so I lived in Romania, I lived in Cambodia, I lived in the West Bank, I lived in Croatia, and I worked on democratic development programs for about 5 years. And so the notion that we are reinventing democracy here in Portland because the other system of democracy just wasn't working for anyone, and now we're coming up with this new system that is dramatically different, and I believe is rooted in the notion of people, elected officials, city council members reconnecting to the neighborhoods and the people that live in those neighborhoods, and are gonna have the time and the resources to do constituent services, legislative oversight, and but legislate in a way that's much more connected than the current council members can even be.
Well, yeah, they can't do it because they're running bureaus.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
I think when those
Multiple
two things
bureaus.
separate, it's going to be better for everybody. Yeah.
And so I want to be part of that. That's really exciting to me. So that's why I'm running.
Awesome. Well, we will watch that race, which
Good.
we have still 7 months of it.
Yes.
So it's a marathon,
and a lot
not
of
a
candidates.
sprint. Yes. So everybody, when we're back, some very hot piping tea. Both Mike and I are going to talk about our own recovery and what you might not realize about the journey from addiction to sobriety when we're back. Welcome to our tea segment, and we definitely both have tea for you today. Both Mike and I have experiences personally with substance use disorder and then long-term recovery. So, Mike, if you don't mind, tell us briefly what was your time in addiction like? What was the nature of it so that people understand what it looks like and what it feels like? Because I think we all have a stereotype of addiction being like that person on the street shooting up or with a bag over their bottle. And that's what I thought. Yeah. But that's not really it for everybody. So tell me a little bit about yours.
That context really matters. Like 19% of Oregonians have a substance use disorder.
Yeah.
That's crazy, right?
Yeah.
That's 1 in 5.
Wow.
And most of them have a story like me or probably like you in that never homeless, never, however, so, I grew up in an Irish Catholic home where alcohol was just, you drank when you're happy, you drank when you're sad, you drank if it was Tuesday afternoon, right? And it was very ritualized. And I just learned that alcohol is how you socialized and how you did business and all this stuff. And so, over the arc of my life, I've had an amazing life, but at about 40, it just, it pivoted from alcohol use. And part of this was part of my coming out story that started in the 30s. When I was in my 30s, not the 1930s, and morphed into then doing party drugs, doing ecstasy out at the dance clubs and stuff like that. And then all of a sudden it was meth. And I went on a downward spiral of meth for 10 years. And by the end, I was actually using intravenously. And that's ultimately what, like, just...
And were you, like, employed during that time and housed? Like...
Yeah, so I did a lot of consulting, and...
I know nothing about this.
And yeah, by the time I maintained a life to some extent, a professional life, but I didn't advance it in any way. And it would ebb and flow, right? All of a sudden I'd be like, okay, I'm never doing that again. But usually if I was trying to get off meth, I was drinking more alcohol as a solution.
Right.
And
addiction switching is a huge thing, yes.
It is. And so, you know, like I said before, I woke up one morning and I reached out for help and got into treatment, and then I started to, you know, I was 46 years old, so I was cognizant of like, oh, this is not just a 28-day thing. And so I enrolled in outpatient for a year, and I went to the Zen Center. I was living in San Francisco at the time, and I just put my life back together one day at a time. But so many people were sort of shocked that I even went to treatment, because even though they would see me drunk, they didn't necessarily know I was drunk, and I was always dressed up, and I was never the guy who drank a bottle of vodka by himself in his apartment and never left, right? Like I was a social drinker,
right.
You know? It was always with a Cosmo in a bar, and then it would end up with meth, you know? So it wasn't pretty. I lost my family in that process. I lost my health in that process, lost all of my money in that process. I lost my reputation, but mostly I lost my soul. Like I didn't like who I was by any stretch of the imagination. And today, I have a kind of boring life, but I'm married to a man I met in AA, and we have 2 dogs, and I have this fantastic, boring life. And
but you're helping
everything.
other people recover too, and that's beautiful and more
Yeah.
significant than anything, right?
Well, thank you. It is. Like, I get to go to work every day knowing that I'm being of service to the recovery community, and that's a big part of my recovery.
Yeah.
Being of service is important, and so, and I'm a privileged white guy in it. You know, I'm now 62, so I can stand up in a room or before a bunch of legislators and say, I'm in recovery. I used to put needles in my arm, and there won't be any fallout for me. If I were black, I probably wouldn't do that, because too many people, they look at me and they think, oh, a guy in recovery. But if I were African American, they would say, oh, former drug addict, right? Like, it's just the way society works. And so I have privilege, so I try to use it as much as possible.
I appreciate that.
Because there are so many people who can't.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the arc of your recovery in terms of how hard you had to work on it? Because you went to outpatient for a year, which is a long time.
Yeah.
But what I've seen before is like when a family member got sober, the rest of my family was celebrating like, oh my gosh, it happened. Yeah. And I was like, no, yeah. This is the starting line. Yeah. So talk just a little bit about it, and if you still have to work on it.
Oh, of course I still work on it. I work on it every day.
Wow.
Like, I still go to AA meetings.
Yeah.
I'm married to someone in recovery, and so all of our circle of friends, for the most part, are people in recovery. But yes, I mean, I chose that first year to do outpatient because I recognized that I needed that level of engagement. And it was, you know, I got to be in group sessions and talk about myself, so that was kind of fun too, right? But and then I just immersed myself in people in recovery, and I think that's really key.
It's huge.
And then after about a year, I took a job, a permanent job that had me doing a lot of work in Yosemite. And so nature was a big part of my recovery.
Yes.
And, you know, at a year sober, to be able to engage and just be in a place like that where I was closest to God in many ways. And I'm not a big believer in faith and stuff like that, although that's part of my recovery. But it was probably 5 years before I could have a conversation like this and talk about it, right? I still have, you know, family members say, "Oh, do you still need to go to AA?" Like, it's a chronic health condition, and if I don't focus on it at least every day and just remind myself, it's why in AA we raise our hand and say, "Hi, I'm Mike. I'm an alcoholic." It's to remind ourselves that I have a condition that I have to work on that day, right? It's a diagnosis that we give ourselves, and so yeah, it's still very much a central part of my life. My recovery and my working on recovery is still an important part of it.
That's awesome.
What about you?
Well, I identify with a lot of what you're saying. definitely alcohol was like very glamorous to me, and I didn't have my first drink until after high school.
Oh, wow.
So I started pretty late, but certainly runs in the family, and certainly have a few of those ACEs that contribute toward like early trauma where, and I have diagnosed like depression and anxiety, and so a lot of it was self-medicating.
Yep.
And I went to a really conservative college, so there wasn't like a lot of partying culture or any of that. But definitely when I was off to the races, it was like a lot. And I moved to New York, and it was like the Sex and the City era.
Yeah.
So, I like to say New York is for alcoholics by alcoholics. Yeah, right. And also that's where AA started, like appropriately. But, there was definitely, I can see like a very specific 10-year arc. Well, I shouldn't say arc, I should say line that was like this. So you can't really see month to month or day to day how it's getting worse, but when I zoomed out and looked like this. And so that was a little over 10 years ago when I stopped drinking. But again, I want to say the circumstances were that, social in that like everyone around me drank, and you always meet out and the bars don't close till 4. And I just kept kind of downgrading my friend circle so I could drink more, like unconsciously, right?
That's what we all do, right?
Yeah.
And it's hard because like baby showers, they have alcohol, right?
Yeah.
Like you go play softball, you drink alcohol.
Yeah.
You go on a date, you drink alcohol. It's just so ingrained in our society. It's hard not to.
And if you are uncomfortable in the world in any way, like as a woman to try to match guys, as a person of color trying to like feeling out of place, as a non-mother at a baby shower, like I have been very drunk in all of those situations, but
because you feel other.
And growing up in certain ways, and so the end for me, I was high functioning. Okay, I was consulting, but I worked 9 to 5. Like I had an apartment in Manhattan. I wasn't on the streets, and I ran marathons every year, and I would dry out before the marathon. So I was like, I don't have a problem.
Right.
And my friends could see it. I know some of them, but they didn't say anything.
Right.
And my intervention was from my doctor, actually. He was
that's great.
He was like, you've been drinking that much for a few years now. And it was like this light bulb, and he kind of gave me permission to get help, which I'm a very independent person.
Right.
And so like I went to my first meeting that night. But like I was in a lot of denial and just not understanding, because our society doesn't understand the nature of it. So it took me a year. The first year was very hard because I would be like changing my mind about it before I accepted it. And it probably wasn't until 5 years where I felt comfortable being more open about it, because I also like had to prove to myself that it was a long-term thing in a way. But any day in the right circumstances or the wrong circumstances, that could change. And I think that's why we keep working out those muscles of saying no.
Oh yeah. I mean, when I was 7 years sober, I had a bunch of shit going on in my life, and I went to a meeting, picked up my chip, and they asked me to share because the person who was speaking didn't show up. So I did, and then that night I made a decision to go relapse, and I tried to score some meth. Like at 7 years sober, and after like literally talking about how great my life was, it just something clicked in my head, and so it's inexplicable. And you just have to, when you're starting to feel really comfortable is when you have to be the most careful in some respects.
I will say it gets easier over time. I don't think about alcohol a lot, but certain situations I know are triggers, and so I try to eliminate those situations, and I have tools, right? Like I like to say your first year, you're like handed an empty toolbox if you make the choice to work on it. But then you have to get all the tools, and you have to learn to use all the tools.
Right.
And even
instinctively, because usually it happens very suddenly, right? That urge in your head, or you're at a party and someone hands you a glass of wine, and you need to instinctively reach for those tools as opposed to be thinking it through because you don't have time.
Right. And that's why you practice like a lot of ridiculous things at the beginning, like. I had a sponsor who was like, call me every day. And I was like, I don't need to call you every day. But then I have this muscle of like picking up the phone, right? And now if I'm feeling weird, I can call someone right away because I'm not overthinking that. But I want to bring up something that is another reason I've been very private about it, is that in AA, which you mentioned, there is an 11th tradition, which is we stay anonymous at the level of press, radio, and films. And I remember in my like early recovery, I I saw an article about a local chef who's very open about theirs.
Oh, yeah.
And it just like, I admired it, but it made me feel so bad because there's this idea sometimes in meetings of like, what a friend calls cash and prizes. Like, I got sober and now I'm a millionaire and I live on the house and I found my spouse and, you know, everything's perfect and I have a life beyond my wildest dreams. And that has not been my experience at all. And I think there's a risk of like, if I'm the only person someone knows in recovery, then they associate, or not in recovery, but in AA, they associate it with me and I'm not the spokesperson and I don't want that pressure.
Right.
But people are way more open about recovery than they used to be because the stigma is going away. So what's just how do you think about that?
So I got sober in AA and I still go to AA and I don't talk about AA meetings. But recovery is now more than AA. I mean, it's actual. It can be medication-assisted treatment. It's treatment. You know, cognitive therapy. It's yoga. It's wellbriety. It's all these other forms. And so we can't be afraid of talking about the concept of recovery because it invites people to see, they're not really boring. They're not really sad. They don't drink, right? And we're not going to address the crisis if we don't have more people that have the privilege of being out. If you're 30 years old and you work at Nike, I don't know that you want to be out about your recovery because you're on a career trajectory, right? And they stopped sending you on business trips because you're going to be in a hotel room by yourself, right? I don't know. It'll be different for everyone. Like I said, I think people of color have a much bigger invisible push against them than privileged gay white guys like me. So you have to pick and choose whether you are, but I feel comfortable talking, singing to the rafters about recovery because it's the thing I'm most proud of in my life. Yeah. And it saved my life.
And I think my sense about you is that you'll be okay no matter what. And so like, even if you lose one opportunity or something happens, like you have a foundation.
Yes, very much so.
One thing I'm very adamant about in this stage is that there's multiple ways to recover. And I think there can be a lot of we could do a whole episode on my AA issues, but like there's a lot of fundamentalism there and it's definitely my primary recovery tool. Yeah. There's a lot of fundamentalism. It can get a little culty, but what I always try to tell people is there are LGBTQ specific meetings. Yes. There are women specific meetings if you have traumas around being vulnerable with men in the room. There are people of color meetings. There's a whole like secret list that's passed around. I will send it to you if you need it. And I almost exclusively go to atheist and agnostic meetings.
Oh, nice, yeah.
Not because I have a problem with God, but I have a problem with Christianity weaving into meetings because it's not necessary. And some people will say you have to do things a certain way, but I know people who were atheists for 30 years and sober who didn't have a sponsor for 30 years. I wouldn't say start with going off the suggested things, but like it can look so many different ways. And now that there's so many other resources and online communities, I have friends who never went to a 12-step meeting and are sober.
Yeah. I think that's hugely important for people to understand. Number one, if you live in a community where there's only 12-step meetings, go to all of them. Go to as many because every meeting is completely different. Yeah. The other thing is, yes, there are fundamentalists, even if they're not religious fundamentalists, about AA. Yeah. And remember, to your point, they're all suggestions. Yeah. The only requirement to participate in AA is a desire to stop drinking. Right. You don't even have to stop drinking. Yeah. And I think that's lost a lot of times on people because they're looking for such significant structure because that's what they need, and I think that's great. But anyone who is walking away from AA because it's the only available recovery support system, then they should try and find another AA meeting or go online now. That's the other. You can find a community online that. Yeah. And yes, I tell a lot of straight women who are just getting into recovery that are uncomfortable with men hitting on them, go to gay men meetings. Yeah. Because we're like, come on, girl, sit down, or
women only. Yeah. There's definitely. I needed that more at the beginning. Now I'm just like the room feminist when I go. But I think online meeting. I mean we were so responsive and resilient in COVID, and everything went online overnight. Yes. And now there's this huge ecosystem of Zoom meetings.
Yeah,
But I want to say,
exactly.
like, the meetings are different and have different vibes, but they're like at the core the same, because
Oh, yeah.
I love going when I travel.
Yes.
It's like
Oh,
like
yeah.
an underground mafia throughout the world, and you meet people. Like, I was once in like Prague, and I found a meeting down a dark alley, like
Yep.
in a basement, which sounds super sketchy, but that's how I have fun now. And I met this like cool dude from London, and we just walked around the city all day and
Nice.
talked,
Yeah.
totally platonic. But like, you meet the coolest people too.
My husband's family lives in Dallas, or outside of Dallas, and so we go to meetings when we're there, and like there's a sign on the door, no guns allowed, and it's
Yeah.
a men's meeting,
Yeah.
and to these gay guys from Portland.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that they all voted for Trump,
Yeah.
or voted to ban marriage or whatever. But the minute we sit down, we are nothing but accepted.
That's my
like, all
same
that,
experience.
There's
Yeah.
no Trump and Hillary supporters in the room.
Yeah.
There's just people in recovery together and trying to do their best.
Yeah.
It's a really there are assholes all over the world in different places, but if you find your place. If you find a meeting, you'll find your people.
Yeah. One thing that really helped me at the beginning, well, first I want to say about AA is like, our mutual friend calls it like the apex predator of recovery. Like, if you shut down that whole thing, you miss out on a tool that's available to you 24/7,
Right.
online or in every town.
Right.
But also the importance of having a group of friends that are sober.
Yes.
Like, so many of my very best friends now in life came through there. But also, like, all the other things, like, I attacked it with every tool I could find
Right.
the first year, and that was inside and out. I think exercise is crucial, because there's a
Yes.
lot of physical recovery and
Yeah.
nutrition, therapy. I saw an addiction counselor. I went to a psychiatrist. My depression is treated, and I'm not like negating its effects by like drowning it out with alcohol. So
Right.
there's a lot of other things outside of maybe a given recovery program that are really important to improving all the elements of your health.
Right. I think that's absolutely true. And the one thing that a lot of AA in particular, or 12-step meetings, don't like medication-assisted treatment, which
Yeah.
is if you have an opioid use disorder, or you're addicted to heroin or fentanyl, Suboxone is very helpful once you get sober in keeping you from having urges to use again, right? There's also medication-assisted treatment for alcohol,
Yeah.
and doctors do not prescribe it. And it's something like 98% of people with an alcohol use disorder are not even told about it. I didn't
Yeah.
know about it until a few years ago.
Yeah.
Right? And we're not talking about that Antabuse, which just makes you throw up. It's called Vivitrol, and it was developed
Yeah.
for alcohol. And that would be hugely beneficial to so many people, but we haven't normalized it in recovery yet.
I think there's enormous hubris or enormous fear in suggesting to anyone that there's only one way to recover.
Right.
Like, we should have as big a tent as possible,
Yep.
get people in whatever way possible so they can get healthy,
Right.
but give them all the tools they could possibly use. I understand where the fear is, that like if you did it a certain way and you think it has to happen that way,
Right.
but like, let's make it, it's just not based in reality, because here's someone who used this tool, here's someone who used that
Yep.
tool, and they're both
And
doing okay.
every day there's more so, right?
Yeah.
But if you go to the Recovery Network of Oregon,
Yeah.
.org,
Okay.
you'll find all kinds of meetings. Refuge Recovery,
Yes.
which is Zen-based,
Yes.
Sobriety, which is Native American-based,
Yes.
SMART, which is not faith-based.
Cognitive behavioral therapy, yeah.
And yoga and recovery. There's just all kinds of different options out there now. People shouldn't go, oh, I don't believe in God, or I don't
Right.
like God, so I'm not going to AA.
Right.
That you don't have to. You
Again,
can-
there's hundreds of atheist and agnostic
Right.
meetings too, so that's no longer exists.
Right.
But you have to do things. You can't just like sit there and be in a
Right.
pity party about your situation. Like,
Right.
it's an action-oriented thing, which can be hard, and that's why you need people also that can help you
Right.
do those things.
There's sober softball. There's sober roller skating.
yeah,
That's
there's
the
a
other
sober
part.
cruise, I heard.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah,
Like,
and retreats and
yeah.
hiking for sure.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot, but you have to go find it, right? It's
Yeah.
not going to come to you per se.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge in the early recovery is you're already feeling really insecure because
Yeah.
your whole life is changing. So
Yes.
it's why you latch on to somebody pretty quickly that's got more time and just trail along with them until you find your feet.
Yeah, and we're talking a lot about
legs.
Alcoholics Anonymous. Even in the 12-step ecosystem, there's Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Gamblers Anonymous. I think there's an internet one now. There's specific
Cocaine
Anonymous,
crystal meth
love
anonymous.
addicts,
Yeah.
sex
Yeah,
addicts,
right.
workaholics. And
Yeah.
so even though I have a primary practice, I think of the thing as like an ism.
Yep.
And sometimes I can beat down this thing, but it pops up somewhere else. So I can't say I've been perfect for 10 years. I have not had a drink or a drug, but let me tell you, sometimes I shop. And let me tell you,
Yeah.
sugar has been a way that I cope
Yeah,
in an
me too.
unhealthy way too. So
Yeah.
I wish I could be one of these, and work, but I wish I could be
Well-
one of these people who goes into like fitness competitions. I have a lot of those friends in recovery.
Great. Like I've never been able to do the fitness thing in recovery. But the other thing that's really awful is our phones, right?
Yeah.
Like I've become totally addicted to my phone.
Yeah, dopamine hits,
Yeah.
and they're designed that way
Right.
too.
Which, you know,
Yeah.
you can't accomplish everything
Yeah.
in life, but it's something you have to be really.
Right.
Sometimes I see my behavior on my phone and the parallels between when I used to drink and use. Like I'm like, okay, I'm going to put it down for an hour.
Yeah. Well, I
I'm
had
not
a
gonna
friend
drink
who was
tonight.
doing that with Grindr, and they
Yeah.
were like, "Not healthy, gotta get off."
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, sex is a big addiction.
Yeah,
too,
or
right?
just attention.
Yeah,
Right?
right.
And manipulating
Yes.
other people,
Yeah.
right? So it's like seeing the signs that you're
Yeah.
sliding in a bad direction.
Yeah.
All right. This has been so fun.
I know.
We should go to a meeting together.
Oh, I would love that.
sometime.
That would be great.
I know.
Yeah, yeah.
It's so good. All right. Well, if you are part of the underground mafia of recovery, please hit us up. Join these communities. Again, where do people find information on what you're doing?
They can go to OregonRecovers.org and get information about our movement to change the system, and it includes all kinds of fun events. And then if you're actually looking for recovery resources, no matter what the resource is, go to recoverynetworkoforegon.org.
And there's
Download
a
the app.
SAMHSA hotline, right?
There's a SAMHSA hotline as well. If you just type in addiction Oregon, you'll get a SAMHSA hotline. Lines for Life is a great organization. They run that. And then you can also just type in AA Portland, and it'll take you to the AA page.
Yeah. Or if you want to go to another city virtually, I'm like, AA New York.
Yeah, exactly.
East Bay,
Yeah.
Paris, who cares?
And definitely
Yeah.
go to meetings in other cities.
Yeah,
it's really
fun.
cool.
Yeah. And also, if you're in a small town, they need new people
Yeah.
to come through, so they're very happy to see you.
It's true.
All right, well, Mike, thanks so much.
Thank
I'm
you.
glad we're friends now. I'm glad we're like trudging this road together.
Likewise.
And when we're back, where the alcohol-free party is at. And now, where the party is at this next week in Portland, everyone is talking about the Lads 500. I didn't even know about this until this week. If you know Lads Edition, it is the quirkiest little design of a neighborhood over in Southeast Portland. It is so cool. It's shaped from an aerial view like a box, but then with like streets that go like this all towards a center circle. And so there is an actual bike relay that goes around the circle 500 times. Don't worry, you don't have to do it by yourself. You can share those 500 laps with someone else. But just Google Lads 500, and just seeing that aerial view is so cool. But if you want to go out and spectate and cheer, that's tomorrow. Also coming up next week is the Jefferson Dancers performing live downtown. These are our most talented teens in Portland in the world of dance. It's through Jefferson High School, and we definitely want to support these young artists and see them perform. The last thing I forgot, because I didn't get my notes. It was something really good. Oh yes, there is a really cool Portland Cleanup Day. It's sponsored by some of our friends, including Ryan at Thesis, and these are just Portlanders that care about seeing our city at its best and seeing it bounce back, and making you know that downtown is actually hopping these days. It's really pleasant, it's beautiful, it's spring, there's great energy, and there's a downtown cleanup next week. So we'll leave the link in our show notes, and hopefully you'll come out and help make Portland better. All right, I'm Ciara Pressler. This is Portland Tea Party. We'll see you next week.